Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noreen, and on behalf of the Ballsbridge, Donnybrook and Sandymount Historical Society and Pembroke Library, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's talk, The Buildings and Personages of Dublin in the Period 1760 to 1820 by Rory O'Farrell. I would like to thank the Historical Society, in particular Chairperson John Houlihan and Secretary Adele O'Connor, for their help in bringing us today's talk and their continued support of Pembroke Library. Today's talk should last about 50 minutes, and afterwards we will have time for questions. If you'd like to write your questions into the Q&A box, I'll ask as many as time allows when Rory has finished speaking. We are recording today's webinar, but as only Rory and myself have to be on the screen, nobody else needs to worry about how they look. So a little bit about Rory before we start. Until retirement, he worked as a designer, technician, photographer and screen printer in the Irish craft industry. As a keen amateur antiquarian, he has served as a council member of several historical and antiquarian societies. For almost 40 years, he's been an active member of the Cambrian Archaeological Association, the Welsh National Archaeological Association. And since retirement, he's been active as a speaker to several local societies when not involved with his writing. And now I'm very happy to hand you over to Rory, for what I'm sure will be a very interesting talk.
Good day, everybody. Why 1760 to 1820? Well, that was what I started out to do. Because in 1757, Thomas Omer was given a £20,000 grant by Parliament to build the Grand Canal. At the end of 1759, Arthur Guinness bought 4 acres at James's Gate. In 1760, George III became king. The South Circular Road was built in 1763 to skirt the Fitzwilliam Estates, followed within a few years by the North Circular Road. So roughly 1760 marks the date of the development of modern inner Dublin. Why 1720? Well, this is the death of George III. Roughly, my talk was intended to be coterminous with the reign of George III. But in fact, I'm going to expand outside of this precise period where it's necessary or appropriate, or I just feel like it. Now, I'm not going to go into the politics of the period, which gave rise to the Act of Union. These are very well dealt with in a very readable book, Dublin Under the Georges, by Constantia Maxwell, and by Maurice Craig in his Dublin 1660 to 1860. These are the main sources. Photography was not invented until the 1830s, but we're fortunate to have the molten depictions of the city at the end of the 18th century. I'm not really looking at the architecture, rather the reason for the buildings. Now, I'm showing you here a map of 1714. This is Moll's map. I'm waiting for the slide to change. There it is. I'm on a new computer and it's just not quite optimized. This is Moll's map of 1714. And you can see that beyond Trinity College, the whole area is mudbank. You can see why Rings End is called Rings End. It's a little spur of land. And the coast is running along roughly what would be Northumberland Road. So anything northeast of Northumberland Road was marshy. Dublin Port was tidal, and vessels had to wait in the bay until the tide permitted them to cross the bar and moor close to the city. The nearest bridge to the sea was Essex Bridge, which we now know as Capel Street Bridge. Rather than spend hours waiting for the tide, it was common for rowboats to take passengers standing off the bar in the bay to take them into the city, sometimes into the city itself, sometimes to Dunleary, which at that stage hadn't been developed as a harbour. Dublin has 2 roles. It's a city, a capital city, a centre of government, but it has its own, how would I put it, its own city council. So these 2 roles, whether it's a capital or whether it's a self-governing city, a little bit confusing. Now, I know everybody will know where we are with this. This is perhaps the one building in Dublin standing on its original foundations, probably pre-Norman. But I'm not going to talk about Christchurch. I'm establishing where we are. Now, with a wave of my magic wand, we go to 1760 and turn around, and what do we see? There we are. This is the Tulsa. It's the toll gatherer's stall at Skinner's Row on the corner of Christchurch Place and Nicholas Street. It's the equivalent of the market hall that you see in English and Welsh towns, an arcaded area on the ground floor for markets, council chamber and civic offices above. These were later used for courts of minor jurisdiction. It was erected in 1683, probably on the site of an earlier one, and it was rebuilt in 1783, but demolished in 1809. Now, there are all sorts of little scenes that we see in some of Malton's pictures. You can see two women having an altercation over on the left. They're being observed from above by a younger woman who's looking out and obviously enjoying the row. There's a woman with a child tugging at her skirts and arresting sedan chairman. Descending the steps is a gentryman. We can tell he's a gentryman because of his wig. He's crossing to his waiting carriage. He might perhaps be declining the proffered services of the young woman beside him. Crossing the street towards them are two elegantly attired young women, hoiking their skirts up from the dirt. We can speculate on their profession. Note that there's an insurance emblem on the building on the left. And we all remember that there are insurance company fire engines in St. Werburgh's just around the corner. The two statues on the top of the Tulsa were Charles I and Charles II. They were carved by Kaiser for £100. And then they discovered they were too small and he was instructed to do something about it. So he stood them both on little plinths. They now live in the crypt in Christchurch and they're not in terribly good condition, but there they are. When originally built, the Tulsa was surmounted with a lantern containing a clock, as you see here in the 1680 drawing by Thomas Dinelli or Thomas Dingley. There's doubt about what his exact name was. Alongside it, I have placed on approximately the same scale the Malta illustration of the 1790s. The clock and lantern were removed between the 1683 build and the 1783 build. And possibly a botched removal, we might speculate, was it perhaps the brother-in-law of one of the councillors? The botched removal caused structural integrity problems for the roof. And by 1790s, the Tulsa was in very poor condition. So the City Council moved from the Tulsa to the City Assembly rooms in South William Street. We may know these better as the former Civic Museum. They were built at the end of the 1760s by the Society of Artists and were rented by the corporation about 1791, then bought by them in 1809. This served as the City Hall until 1852. The next illustration shows what the Wide Street Commissioners did. They were established in 1757, and their first task was to make an impressive wide street from Capel Street over the bridge to the castle. Over the part of the bridge on the left, we can see a building with a row of dormer windows, roughly on the site of what was the Clarence Hotel. This was the old custom house, which we will come to shortly. Notice also the masts on the left of the bridge. This was the limit of navigation for seagoing vessels. Looking at some of the people in the illustration, we see a girl with a basket on her head. What might she be selling? Possibly small fruit such as strawberries, because it cannot stack too high. Beside the man on the horse is an undoubted beggar. He may be ex-military, his staff or crutch definitely suggests that he's disabled. On the right is a rather unkempt man with a bell. He may be selling brick dust or sand used for scouring. Alternately, he may have a bag of soot. Sweeps sold the soot for use as a fertilizer. Now, as I say, this laptop is not quite optimized. The Wide Street commissioners made a 100-foot square vacant in front of the castle, and they decided to build an exchange here. The design was selected by competition, and this is Cooley's design. It had a main dealing floor on the ground level with offices above. And in fact, the Royal Exchange and the Baltic Exchange in London were similar. In 1857, this became the City Hall, and the corporation moved here from the City Assembly Rooms, what we know as the Civic Museum. More or less at the time of the move to the City Assembly Rooms, the court sittings moved to the courthouse in Green Street, which was built in 1797. Little detail on the left. You see a milliner proffering a sample hat for approval to the Grand Lady in her coach. Her footman, complete with his staff, stands beside him. If you ever read E.F. Benson's Map and Lucia books, you will recollect that Mrs. Wise used to do her shopping from her Royce. Note that, not a Rolls Royce, a Royce, relaying her orders through her chauffeur to the tradesman who came out to deal with her. The chief dignitary of the corporation, the Lord Mayor, lived in the Mansion House, built on Dawson Street by Joshua Dawson in 1710. As you see it here, it was remodeled in 1851 and the porch added in 1886. The round room behind it was a quick erection of 1821 to house a banquet on the occasion of the visit of George IV. The supper room, where many exhibitions are held, is even later. That's 1864. Of course, an important part of the dignity of a city is marked by the regalia of the Lord Mayor, or the Mayor. In Dublin's case, the Lord Mayor was distinguished by having a mace and a sword of state borne before him, and a gold collar of Essex. He may also ride in a ceremonial coach. Such coaches were very important. Jonah Barrington tells how Napoleon, from his own funds, provided elaborate coaches for his ministers so that they might uphold the dignity of their office. Was this the equivalent of the ministerial Mercedes? Here is another coach. This is the Irish state coach, built in London in 1790 and brought to Ireland for the Lord Chancellor, the Earl of Clare. In the late 1940s, my father worked as head scenic artist for the Theatre Royal in Dublin, which was also associated with the Gaiety Theatre at the time. For a pantomime, probably Cinderella, he needed to design a coach and he wished to use an Irish original. So he inquired and eventually discovered that the Irish state coach was kept in a shed in the Upper Castle Yard. He made an appointment to go and see it to make some sketches. The yard man, who was pensioner, probably a little buckety leg, opened the doors and dragged the coach out and said, "Will you be taking it now, sir?" And my father said he always regretted that he didn't take it. Here's Scales map. And we can see this is, as I remember, 1760s, mid-1760s. You can see that the limit of development is Merrion Street and Stephen's Green is established. But the land has been filled in under or northeast of what would now be the Northumberland Road. One of the major buildings of Dublin has its origin as the seat of government. For a time, the Irish Parliament met in Chichester House on College Green. This was a house built on the site of a suppressed nunnery, St. Mary de Hogs. Chichester House was built in the early 1600s, and the site now becomes the present Bank of Ireland. The house stood in its grounds back from the street. By 1720, it had reached a stage of dilapidation and the Parliament moved out. But if you look at the map here and the picture, you will observe some of the angles of the road. The road angles, the road property boundaries continue, and they're very, very important to look at the historical continuity of property boundaries. The Parliament moved over to what we now know as the King's Inns. At that time, it was the Blue Coat School. That later became the King's Hospital, and then the King's Inns. In this picture by Moulton, you see a central tower. That wasn't built, and it was its footings were replaced by a cupola in 1894. It was intended that the entire complex should be completed by buildings surrounding a square at the back, opening onto Henrietta Street. But these were never completed. While seated here, the Parliament decided that the time had come to build a new structure for their use. This was to be the first purpose-built building to house a two-chamber Parliament in the world. There we are. In 1720, Speaker Connolly and the Lords Chief Justices laid the first stone. The Parliament continued in the Blue Coat School for 3 years, and then they were able to use part of the new building, which took about 10 years to complete. We see also the new front of Trinity, completed about 1756. In the illustration, you see many scenes of interest. Emerging from the courtyard is a coach with a coat of arms on the door, perhaps the Speaker's coach. On the steps at the left is a beggar. On the island of the courtyard are 3 gentlemen having a little chat. In the foreground is a hawker with her stock of goods in her basket on her head. The cart in the centre foreground is selling fish. You can see the heads of the fish protruding at the back left. Presumably the gentleman on horseback is ordering a fish for his dinner, which will be delivered. The fish cart is of the form of an Irish noddy. Look at the man on the left with the stick. Do you see the bruises on the plate in front of him? Well, this is the second edition of the plate, and this is the first edition. We see originally he was driving pigs, which have been removed. Also removed have been 2 women. I haven't been able to find a colour reproduction of this first edition. My recollection, and I'm thinking back to 1993, my recollection is that there's a copy of the first edition in the Cashel Palace Hotel. It's said, I haven't checked it up, that the Bank of Ireland, or not the Bank of Ireland, the Parliament objected to the pigs being shown in the first edition and caused it to be re-engraved. This is a watercolour by Moulton of a scene within the front courtyard of the Parliament. You notice a lot of people standing around, perhaps waiting for members of Parliament that they might lobby. And there is another picture, almost from the same position, by Francis Weekley in 1782. You see the Speaker entering, preceded by the mace bearer. His carriage is just visible between the pillars, and you see the same loungers around as previously. In the House of Commons in England, Neil Killock tells the story that the Speaker's procession was going through the central lobby, and somebody called out to him, "Neil, Neil," and all the American onlookers dropped to their knees. There's another story about the bank, the Parliament building. I keep calling it the Bank of Ireland because that's what we know it as. A visitor to Dublin asked his cab driver, who were the statues on top? And the cab driver said, sure, they were the 12 apostles. The visitor was a bit puzzled and he said, but there's only 3 of them. And the cab driver said, sure, you wouldn't expect them all to come out and get wet at the one time. They did take it in turns. Here's a picture of the interior. Henry Grattan in uniform with Irish Party in volunteer uniforms all speak a meeting. This is one of these pictures where everybody in it can be identified if you knew who they were. Across the road from the Parliament building was the Thing Mound. And there is one illustration of the Thing Mound, which I give you here, standing beside St. Andrew's Church. This was reputedly the location of governing assemblies in Norse times, and Henry II is said to have had constructed a wicker and thatched building of the Irish style to hold his Christmas festivities in and to receive the submission of Irish kings. The mound was later removed and used to fill and raise the level of Nassau Street. The range familiar to all of us as Trinity College was built in 1752 to 59 with funding from the Parliament. Notice the porter with a large pack on his back making his way along the pavement. If you know this area, you'll notice that the buildings on the right have been rebuilt. One of the establishments in this range is the tobacconist James Fox. The story is told of another Dublin tobacconist, Lundy Foot. He had set up his coach, which we might think as the equivalent of buying a new Mercedes after years of driving a clapped-out Ford. He asked John Philpot Curran for a suitable motto for the side of his coach, explaining that he wanted it in Latin so that it would add dignity. Curran suggested quid rides, which identifies the courage, quid rides as the tobacconists, but also means, what are you laughing at? In the centre, we see a groom leading his master's horse, perhaps to Doyles Clubhouse behind the Parliament building. Trinity is a copyright library granted in 1801, and its holding was originally based on the library of Archbishop Usher, which included many manuscripts. Cromwell intervened and prevented the dispersal of the library on Usher's death in 1656. This is perhaps the only good thing that anybody in Ireland would remember Cromwell for. The Book of Kells lived in Kells until 1654, and Cromwell's cavalry at that year were quartered in the church in Kells, and the governor of the town sent the book to Dublin for safekeeping. Henry Jones, who later became Bishop of Meath after the Restoration, gave the manuscript to Trinity College in 1661. This shows you the long room as originally built with a flat ceiling. In 1857, Woodward replaced the flat ceiling with the barrel vault, which I think greatly improves the appearance of the space. Trinity, I should say, the library is undergoing extensive renovations at the moment. And I think it will be quite changed when we see it. They'll probably be taking it back as far as possible to the original state, but I don't think they will change the arched ceiling. The Provost's house was and still is the residence of the Provost of Trinity. Dublin has 3 live-in jobs with their own accommodation: the Master of the Rotunda, the Provost of Trinity, and the Dean of St. Patrick's. The Provost's house is the oldest residential building in Dublin, still in use for its original purpose. The surrounding wall has been greatly increased in height since this engraving, presumably to prevent students returning at irregular late hours in breach of discipline. The building on the right, the red brick building, is the start of Grafton Street proper. In its later rebuild, it was Yates, the opticians and instrument makers. Further down on the left, opposite the Provost's house, we may remember another optician and instrument maker, Dixon Hempinstall, founded in 1908. Facing us, also on the left, is a lottery office. This we might remember as Hamilton Long, the chemist. I showed you, drew your attention to various carts. These are the form of what's known as the Irish noddy. And here's one, single axle vehicle. They seem to have been quite common in Ireland. The ones we have seen, most of them had solid wheels, which suggests that they were not expensive. You can appreciate how impractical the single axle is for transport of heavy loads or many people. College Green was a major area for public meetings, as we have seen in our time with the address from President Obama and others. The major statue of the area, situated where the statue of Thomas Davis currently stands, was of William III, King Billy. This was carved in 1701 by Grinding Gibbons. As you might imagine, this was a sacred image for Orangemen and an object of derision for nationalists. It was regularly blown up, daubed with paint, decorated with frivolous items, usually chamber pots or corsets, and is regularly honoured by the Orange fraternity. It ultimately met its doom, its final doom, which had been blown up on several occasions, but 1929, it was blown up completely. There it is, gone. This picture by Weekley of a volunteer meeting lets us see a reasonably complete Parliament House and Trinity College. On the left, we see some of the Dutch billies, which were a common feature of Dublin architecture. These were later replaced by Doyles Clubhouse, which we will come to in a few minutes. But to let us get a good view of him, here is a photo of King Billy. You'll notice that he is in Roman costume. Unfortunately, along with all the other equestrian statues of Dublin, he was blown to smithereens, and we now have no good equestrian statues. And to be honest, I don't care who they were of. They were lovely pieces of work, and I'm sorry that they're gone. The building on the right was formerly the Hibernian Bank and the National Irish Bank, and it's now H&M. Go into it and look at the ceiling and the plasterwork. These are all listed, and you will note that the display cases and so on are stood off on special little standoffs so that they don't damage the plasterwork. As we move up Dame Street, we come to Dublin Castle, which stands on the site of the original stronghold of Dublin. Brooking's map of 1728 shows it in transition from the medieval castle to a less defensive structure, more suited to the grandeur of the Lord Lieutenant's quasi-regal court. For some time, the various upper courts of justice sat in the castle, but in 1610 they moved out. The castle became the site for the Lord Lieutenant's formal receptions. Now, this is de Gaume's map, and if you do a quick count, you'll see that between 1673 and 1728, some of the towers have vanished. And that just puts the castle in its present position. Here is the castle yard. I'm waiting for it to come up. I'll try it again. Yes, it was the centre of aristocratic social life. In the 1860s, Mrs. Smith, who is better known perhaps as the Highland Lady, although she only lived in the Highlands for a short period, she lived much longer in Blessington. She tells of her anxiety that she should be on the guest list so that she and her daughters could attend the functions. She said she didn't care about them at all. Damn it all, don't care about this sort of thing. But she wanted her daughters to meet the right sort of people. She was trying to get her younger daughter, Janie, married off. She tells also of the various ladies in attendance trying to outdo each other with outfits made from Irish cloth and lace. Earlier, I showed you the Tulsa as drawn by Thomas Donnelly in 1680. Did you feel it was a bit top heavy? Here it is again, roughly to scale with the Bedford Tower. You can see that the building masses are the same and the superstructures more or less. I showed you the dormer windows of the old custom house. Here it is on the left. This was roughly on the site of the Torrance Hotel and ran through to Essex Street behind it. Now, there's a little story about Essex Street, which I put in because, I mean, elephants are very important when you know about them. In 1680, a visiting elephant was housed in a booth at the back of Essex Street, and the booth took fire and the elephant was burnt to death. Alan Mullen decided to dissect the elephant, and a special little covering was erected, and the militia were called out to prevent the populace chopping up the elephant for souvenirs. And Mullen started to systematically dissect the elephant. But because of the effect of the fire and because of the heat of the weather, the elephant started to go off. And in a hurry, he had to bring in a number of butchers, and they really just dissected the elephant to get the skeleton. The skeleton, I believe, lives in the Moyne Institute in Trinity and can be seen there when the museum is open. In 1707, the upper stories of the old custom house had become unsafe, and the larger shipping wasn't able to get up the river because of the bar, because the river hadn't been embanked, it hadn't been dredged. So they decided to build a new custom house further down river. You'll notice if you look at this picture, the traffic on the river. There's a water taxi on the left with a little awning over the ladies in it. Another small boat also on the left, just probably servicing some of the moored vessels. Just beyond them, you see mastless vessels, lighters, which are designed to pass under the bridges with cargo. And that might remind us all of the Guinness tugs that used to bring their products down to the Lady Patricia for export in our childhood. The new custom house was designed by Gandon, who got the contract because of his friendship with John Beresford, a member of the Wide Streets Commission. They started work in 1781 on a reclaimed portion of marshy land, where it was built on a raft of brick, timber, and stone. It was generally regarded as a sumptuous edifice, whose only fault was that old Beresford is lodged in it. Another report of the time indicates that Beresford and his secretary and their staff between them occupied half of the building. We know of the keystones on the arches from the old Irish pound notes when we had real money. I showed you the Dutch billies, and these were rebuilt to form, at the end of the 18th century, to form Doyles Clubhouse, which was convenient to the Parliament House. Some of the sources suggest that it was financed by wealthy members of the Parliament. There was certainly a special side door adjacent to the Parliament across Foster Place. Descriptions exist of members of the House arriving in the evening, attired in evening dress coats, adorned with gold braid, white pantaloons, satin waistcoats, and gold buckled shoes. It was famous for the quality of its cellar and notorious for the high stakes of its gambling. But as happens with all Irish organisations, what do we expect? There was a split. A row in 1787 arose from the blackballing of a very popular young man, the son of Lord Cunningham. This led to the establishment of the Caldera Street Club. Now, I can't find a picture of the Caldera Street Club as it was originally in Kildare Street. But here is a picture of the building that now stands on its site. This is the Royal College of Physicians, and they built these premises on the site of the original Kildare Street Club. It was sold to the College of Physicians in 1851. It was burnt down 11th of November 1860. It was sold and was burnt down on the 11th of November 1860. 3 waitresses were burnt to death, and the 4th was rescued in her night attire from the bedroom of the club accountant. Now, that's the story, and as it was reported, I think in the Evening Mail at the time. She wasn't named, thank God. The club's new premises on the corner of Kildare Street were under construction, and the fire forced that the club moved into them before full completion. The Kildare Street Club soon outstripped Daly's in notoriety, both regarding its cellar and its gambling. Because it was removed from the Parliament, it suited gentry who were not so politically active, and it continued as a gentry haunt until nearly our own day. Those who have read or seen on TV Dorothy L. Sayers' The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club may have an idea of what club life was like. Just for completeness, here is a picture of the Kildare Street Club as built in 1861. We now know this is the Alliance Française. We're viewing it from the grounds of Trinity College. Note that these are not walled off from their surroundings, and they're actually lower than the road because the road had been infilled with the remains of the Thing Mound. There we are. A court for minor matters used to sit in the Tulsa. The major courts, the 4 courts, Chancery, King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer, sat first in the castle, then from about 1610 in a now vanished building near Christ Church Cathedral. There is one illustration of the ruins of this building, but I haven't been able to obtain a copy of them. The original building was a house for the Deans of Christ Church and was rebuilt about 1695 by Sir William Robinson. By the 1780s, the rebuild was in a very bad state of repair and very cramped for space, so the new 4 courts were commenced in the mid-1780s across the river. This illustration is taken from Ormond Bridge, swept away in a flood of 1802. It was replaced by Richmond Bridge, now O'Donovan Rosser Bridge, which would have crossed our picture from the cart on the right, in other words, slightly upstream. The riverside buildings looked to be in a state of decay. They were cleared and the embankment built by 1816. The river is embanked in this picture only on the right. Facing the boat looks to be a scavenger, perhaps similar to the mudlarks described by Dickens in Our Mutual Friend. On the river, you see rafts of timber being moved behind the rowboats. Beyond the 4 courts, roughly Midellis Key, was a large inlet used for the wet storage of timber, which speeds the seasoning process. And in the distance, you see the oldest bridge site in Dublin, rebuilt 1618. Many of the young men of Dublin did the Grand Tour. And there are stories of gangs of them known as macaroni, rakes, bucks, bows, dandies, according to precise category. Here is a caricature of one of the young men about town. And here is the master. It's a French illustration of a hairdresser, but he's dressed in high style, presumably to show his clients what they could achieve. By 1813, dress had sobered down. This is a picture of some fashionable Bond Street loungers in London from 1813. You can see that the style is approaching that of Victorian respectability. From the left, you have the Duke of Sefton, the Earl of Sefton, the Duke of Devonshire, Lord Manners, Poodle Bing, and the Poodle, and the Duke of Beaufort. The trousers were the invention of Beau Brummel some short time before, and you can see that four of the gentlemen here are wearing them. They're all strapped under the high instep of the shoe. Now, here is a picture of Stephen's Green. Yes, the Bow Walk running from across the green on the north side from what would be commonly called Traitor's Gate to the Shelburne Hotel. As you can see it was a fashionable place to promenade. In the middle is a statue of George II by Van Nost, also blown up. The tall building just to the left of the tree on the right is 86 St. Stephen's Green, the home of Thomas Buckwelli. This was built about 1768 by his father, Richard Burnchapel Whaley. As a boy, Buckwelli had an allowance of £900 and was sent to school in England and then to France that he might have a full education. He wrote his memoirs telling of his education and gambling. He was a very heavy gambler, and so were his companions. Much drinking and accompanying violence. He tells of how he went to Jerusalem and back for a bet. At dinner at the Duke of Leinster's, Whaley was asked where he was going to next. To Jerusalem. The opinion about the table was that he couldn't go and return in 2 years, and there were very heavy stakes wagered on it. His memoirs tell of his journey and how he returned, having spent £8,000, making a profit of £7,000 on the bet. That would be the equivalent of 12 to 15 million, and making a profit of 10 to 12 million euro. Having dissipated his fortune of £400,000, which would be the equivalent of 600, 700 million euro, he returned to the Isle of Man with his mistress, where he died at the age of 38, and his house is now a hotel. Many of the memoirs in Dublin are memoirs of lawyers. This is John Philpot Curran. He and his friend John Bully Egan had a difference of opinion, presumably after much drinking, and insults were exchanged and a duel was organized. They met on the field, and Egan pointed out that Curran was a very small man and he was large, and the thing wasn't very equal at all, because he presented a much easier target for Curran than Curran did for him. So Curran said that he would stand against Egan, and his seconds could draw his outline on Egan in chalk, and only shots within that area would count. And the two of them looked at each other and they started to laugh and they shook hands and they all went off for a very liquid breakfast. There are other stories told by, lost the name, it'll come back to me, of various parliamentarians. My favorite one is Boyle Roche, Sir John Boyle Roche. He said, "Why should we legislate for posterity? What has posterity ever done for us?" He was the master of the mixed metaphor. He said that he was sorry he wasn't a bird because he couldn't be in two places at once. And then he said that there were at present such goings on, everything was at a standstill. My favorite one is that he felt if French principles should take root in Ireland, we might all come down to breakfast one morning and find our bloody heads on the table staring us in the face. There are many other stories. There's the story of the lawyers who hired a cottage for a few days up in the hills, and the cottage had just been redecorated. One of the lawyers lay down on a settle with his head against the wall, and when he woke up, he found that his hair was attached to the plaster work on the wall because the paint had been wet. And he asked his friends, "Please, will you cut me off, chop the bit of hair off so that I can get up?" And they said, no, no, no. Now the legal situation is you are now part of the building and you are the landlord's responsibility. So we can't cut your hair at all. I don't know how the story ended, but I presume they did cut him free. The Custom House, not the Custom House, the GPO and Nelson Pillar were not built until nearly 20 years after Malton's engravings. This is a picture of them by Samuel Brocas, and it was later engraved by his son Henry Brocas, and there's at least one more engraving of the scene from the same position. The pillar was built in 1808 to a design by Francis Johnson and William Wilkins. The GPO was designed by Johnson and was built in 1814. It has been refurbished on a number of occasions, particularly after the fire of 1916, which gutted the building. Sackville Street was faulted as not aligning with the hospital at the end. At the rotunda end was erected an ersatz city gate at which to formally welcome George IV on his visit to Dublin in 1821. But his visit is another story. Now, I hope you have enjoyed our little saunter around Dublin. I give you this last picture, a photograph from almost exactly the same position as the Brocas painting. And some of us may just remember the trams. I can remember a tram in 1948 running with my mother. I was 3, just barely able to stand on my feet, and she holding my 1-year-old sister in her arms to get a number 8 tram out to Sandy Cove to see her mother. So that's all I have to tell you. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Hi, Rory. Sorry about that. I had trouble there turning my sound back on. So we have a couple of questions and a few comments, but Adrian mentioned you were talking about living positions in Dublin, and she just mentioned that Marsh's Library also had a live-in accommodation, and it would have been a relative of her father's. She was the librarian there, and that she lived in rooms underneath the library for years. And she just mentions that it was very cold because no fires or anything were allowed.
Yes, it would be. It would be.
But Teresa mentions that so much of the city is recognizable still. And she was saying, what do you think how the city looks now compared to then?
I come into the city and I make strange. It's not the Dublin I grew up in and the Dublin I loved. If you're interested in the Dublin of the 1950s and 60s, there's a film called Another Shore, which is worth looking out for. Tells the story of a young Dublin man whose ambition is to go and live in Rarotonga. And it's his adventures in trying to go and live in Rarotonga in the South Pacific. It was written by a judge, Kenneth Redden, about perhaps 1958. I'm not exactly certain, but worth looking for, just if you want to see bits of old Dublin before it started to modernize.
Deirdre mentions that she thought the equestrian statue of King Billy was moved to the Boyne Valley.
No, it was blown up, and it was blown up in the mid 1900s, 1856 or thereabouts, maybe 1838. It was blown up and reassembled, and it was reassembled in such a way that one leg was shorter than the other, so that if the horse was a real horse, he'd have fallen over. And then blown up again, did I say 1929? And the head was, the remains were melted down, I think 1949.
Do you have a favorite building yourself from that time period?
Bewley's in Grafton Street in the old days. But that's because I liked their buns and their coffee. And you can't get buns and coffee like that anymore.
No. Oh, it's nice to have it open again. But most of the comments are just compliments to you, Rory. Everyone is saying how much they enjoyed the talk. And oh, somebody says the film you mentioned, that's a brilliant film. So they've obviously seen it. Caroline Duff said that she saw it, obviously, so it's a brilliant film. And more people are just saying they'd love to hear more from you, that they've really enjoyed the talk. And so it's always a good sign when you leave people wanting more.
Anytime to come and talk. I would love to come in person, because there's nothing like talking to a live audience, because you get a reaction and you get sometimes interjections which are relevant, particularly to the person who makes them. You know, they've been reminded of something and they start to relive some episode in the past. So it'd be very happy to come and talk at any time.
Dr. Ellis wants to know, what was the population of Dublin by 1820?
If I said 100,000, it's that sort of figure, but I don't know, to be honest. I'd have to look it up. I try not to remember things that I would have to check if I were writing about them. Yeah. You know, you always have to check your facts when you're writing something. So there's no point in remembering that it was 1,273 million. You know, you have to look at the figure to get it when you're putting it down on paper.
Paul wants to know, when did the canon appear at the Bank of Ireland?
I don't know. I would think they might have been after either Waterloo or Trafalgar, but I have no definite information on them. One of the sources is Gilbert's History of the City of Dublin. There are two other books, Maurice Craig's Dublin 1660 to 1860, which was published by Alan Figgis, republished by Alan Figgis, I think about 1961. My copy has fallen to bits, and this reprint by Revival Press some years ago, which I picked up in a charity shop for €1, and Dublin Under the Georges by Constantia Maxwell. Both of these are very enjoyable reads, well worth looking at. The Dolman Press in 1981 published all the Malton engravings. Now, unfortunately, at the time, I never realized that they had published the second edition of the Bank of Ireland, or I would have complained to Liam Miller about it and said, well, we've got to put in the first edition, the one with the pigs. Even if it was only put in as a thumbnail somewhere.
Have you done, you know, your writings yourself? Have you, did you show books? Bernadette was saying, did you show some books at the start, that at the beginning of the talk?
There were these two books, Dublin Under the Georges and Dublin Maurice Craig. My own writing, I'm writing a continuation to the P.G. Woodhouses to tell the story of what happened to Jeeves and Bertie during World War II. I've done one book of that, and I'm now at the stage just after the war with the two of them.
Very good.
I'm doing another book on a continuation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, trying to describe how Elizabeth Bennet settled into being mistress of Pemberley. And I have a third book, of which I have written 2 volumes. I have a third volume to write, which is fitting between Trollope's The Last Chronicle of Barset and the Duke's Children, to describe the death of Lady Glencora. But these are all stuck because I'm lacking the society of people that I would talk to, not necessarily about the books, but you get the stimulation from just chatting and sitting around a table. And a very good friend who would have understood about a lot of this period died last year, and you know, I miss her too. But I'll get back to them in due course.
Yeah. So there's a question here about the film you mentioned. Who's the director, so they can help, you know, to help them find the film?
I can't tell you offhand. It's available certainly available if you look for it. Another Shore is the name of it.
Okay.
And you'll find it coming up on some of the DVD sites in the UK, or you might even find a second-hand copy of it. World of Books and Book Depository both do second-hand DVDs and are well worth looking for film on those before you buy it new.
Caroline mentions here that it's often shown on Talking Pictures TV channel.
Yes, it would be. Talking Pictures is a very nice channel because it shows the old films that nobody pays much attention to. 306 is what it is on my satellite.
As I said, the rest are all just compliments, Rory, and just even people are saying that they'd like to pass on their email to you, because maybe to get you to talk with, say, other places and stuff like that. So I'll do that. Adrian asked me to pass it on, so I'll send that on to you and stuff like that. So I think that's it. So thanks very much. So I'd like to thank Rory for this fascinating and informative talk. I definitely learned a lot. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended this afternoon. So keep an eye out on the web page of the Ballsbridge, Donnybrook and Sandymount Historical Society and the Pembroke Library Facebook page for both a recording of Rory's talk and also for information on our upcoming talk for March. So thanks again, Rory, and thanks everybody, and hopefully see you all soon. So take care. Bye.
Bye.